Welcome back to Mission of the Chosen, where we expose control, reclaim your voice, and rebuild inner power. Today's message reveals why freedom unsettles others and how to stay truly unshaken. Let's settle in. You didn't become difficult. You simply stopped being programmable. That's the moment the story changed, not because you turned reckless, but because you stopped moving on command. When control loses its grip, it rarely admits weakness. It blames the rope for slipping. It blames the sand for falling. It blames you for refusing to shrink. Think of it like a stage play everyone agreed to perform. For a long time, you hit your mark, said the expected lines, and tried to keep the peace. But peace built on performance is a quiet kind of exhaustion. One day, you stepped off the chalk mark and spoke like yourself. The lights didn't go out, the illusion did. The audience began to notice the wires, the painted backdrops, the fact that the thunder was just a metal sheet behind the curtain. You didn't break their world. You revealed what held it together: your compliance. Here's the uncomfortable truth that helps everything click. Control only works with consent. Psychologists have written about it for decades. Power is social. It breathes through recognition. The moment you stop affirming it, it starts gasping. That's why your boundaries felt like rebellion to them. If someone believes obedience equals love, a calm no sounds like blasphemy. Let me offer a calmer frame. You didn't declare war. You discovered weight, the weight of your own agency. You realized your inner world doesn't need external permission slips to move. That's when labels started flying: stubborn, arrogant, rebellious, hard to love. None of those were mirrors. They were tools. Tools meant to push you back into the box marked predictable. But watch what happens when you don't climb back in. Picture a fist squeezing dry sand. The tighter the grip, the faster it escapes. When control watched the grains slide, it blamed the sand. That's projection in plain clothing. The hostility you felt wasn't triggered by your character. It was triggered by their loss of leverage. And yes, it can be dizzying when the people who talk most about respect are the ones who revolt the moment you set a fair boundary. Boundaries are not swords, they're shields. A shield doesn't wound, it stops the bleeding. You held yours, and it said, without shouting, "My time is mine, my attention is mine, my peace is mine." The people who were with you for the right reasons understood. The ones who were with you for access, not relationship, called it rebellion and tried to turn the room against you. Because without your open-door policy, their favorite hallway closed. Here's something practical you can carry into your week. Stop over-explaining. When someone has already decided to misunderstand you, more words become more rope for them to twist. Silence is not retreat, it can be strategy. Every time you decline to audition for their version of you, their narrative lost oxygen. And the people watching, the ones who matter, noticed the asymmetry. Why was one person yelling and the other person steady? Why did the trouble always appear when boundaries showed up? Reality began doing what it always does. It separated noise from signal. The quiet power you're stepping into isn't about winning arguments. It's about making arguments unnecessary. Real stability doesn't panic under questions. It answers them. Real leadership doesn't demand submission. It earns respect. When your independence made them louder, it also made the truth clearer. You were not the storm. You were the mountain that refused to move. Let's expand that image for a second. A tempest tears through a valley, throwing branches, rattling windows, shouting through the trees. It wants you to believe wind equals authority, but the mountain knows better. It doesn't compete with the storm, it endures. Calm is not the absence of power, it's power learned. That's where you're standing now, on bedrock you didn't realize you owned. And this is where exposure happens quietly. The moment your life no longer pivots around their approval, their toolkit goes dull. Guilt loses its hook. Shame stops sticking. Reward and punishment games run out of runway. Independence doesn't just set you free. It makes manipulation visible to everyone else. The puppeteer isn't terrifying when the strings go slack. He's just a man holding threads that no longer matter. I want to name something else. The peacemaker role you carried. It looked noble. It sounded spiritual. It kept the room calm. But it asked you to dislocate yourself to keep others comfortable. That's not peace. That's a tax on your nervous system. The cost was hiding your anger, editing your joy, resizing your truth. You can honor harmony without sacrificing wholeness. The new alignment is this: I refuse to mistake my silence for love or your comfort for wisdom. A quick word for creators and builders among us, especially if your niche requires you to show up consistently. Integrity is your audience. When you stand, they sense it. You don't need to shout that you've changed. People can hear when a voice is no longer echoing the room that once controlled it. That resonance, calm, clean, direct, attracts the right crowd and releases the rest. If you're new here, a gentle ask. Tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. We keep the ask light in this space because your time is sacred, but if the message helps, support it. That energy keeps the work moving. Now, back to the heart. Controllers don't actually crave peace. They crave silence, your silence. Peace requires equality, honesty, mutual respect. Silence only requires someone to go small. You outgrew small. When you stopped shrinking, they called your growth defiance. When you stopped apologizing for being clear, they called your clarity cold. But clarity is warmth that refuses to burn itself to keep everyone else toasty. Let's flip the lens one more time. You didn't expose people. Truth did. You just stopped dimming the light. Authenticity is inconvenient for performance-based authority because it reveals the trick. Borrowed power. Borrowed power always collapses when the lender wakes up. You woke up, and the throne made of expectations turned into a chair made of paper. So here's the invitation for the days ahead. Stop debating your worth in courts that were never fair. Keep the boundary, even if your voice shakes. Choose clean exits over messy explanations. Let your steadiness be the loudest thing in the room. And if you need a sentence to keep handy when pressure shows up, try this. I'm not rejecting connection. I'm rejecting control. That line is a compass. It points you back to center when someone tries to rename your shield a sword. You were never the problem. You were the interruption to a cycle that required your compliance. When you stepped away, the theater lost its star. The show didn't end because you threw a fit. It ended because the only person keeping it credible left the stage. Hold this, wear it like armor, move through your week with it. You don't have to prove anything to anyone who needs you small to feel big. The calm you're building is not passivity, it's precision. It's choosing where your energy lives and refusing to spend it on illusions. The chains that hold the strongest aren't made of iron, they're made of control, and the moment you stop bowing to it, the chains fall apart. Let that sink in for a second. Chosen one. Now imagine this for a moment. Someone has their hands wrapped around a puppet, moving its arms, making it dance, pulling every string. The puppet isn't free. It's predictable. It's obedient. But what happens the day that puppet cuts its strings? The puppet master doesn't clap, doesn't celebrate. He panics because without control, he has nothing. That is exactly what has happened to you. And here's the fact most people don't realize. Control only works if you agree to it. Psychologists have studied this for years. Power isn't really power unless others recognize it. The greatest empires in history didn't collapse because of swords or fire. They collapsed because people stopped believing in their rulers. When the people withdrew their agreement, the throne turned to dust. This isn't opinion, it's historical truth. The universe has always rewarded freedom over forced submission, and chosen one. You represent that freedom. That's why they called you the problem. Not because you were wrong, not because you were destructive, but because you refused to be controlled. And thank you, chosen one, for being here with me right now. Don't forget to pay this message forward by simply pressing the like and subscribe button to help spread this message to more souls. It's our responsibility to share the light and break these illusions for as many people as possible. Thank you for being part of this mission. You are part of a force greater than you realize. Now, let's come back to the heart of our message. They're finally seeing it. They're finally realizing the truth that was right in front of them all along. You weren't the problem. The problem was their obsession with control. Think of it like this. When someone loses their grip on a rope, they don't blame their weak hand. They blame the rope for slipping away. That's what they did to you. They tried to twist the story to frame you as reckless, unstable, the villain. But underneath it all, the truth was simple. They couldn't puppeteer you anymore. They couldn't dictate your words, your movements, your choices. And in that frustration, they turned you into their enemy. But here's where the story gets interesting. They weren't actually fighting you. They were fighting their own powerlessness. It was their reflection in the mirror that terrified them, not your freedom. They were staring at a version of themselves that had no control, no influence, no command. That is what scared them the most. You didn't rage, you didn't fight back, you simply stepped away from their script, and without your role in their performance, the entire stage fell silent. History again repeats itself here. Do you know what terrified ancient kings more than armies? It wasn't rebellion, it was indifference. When the people stopped listening, the throne stopped mattering. When the audience leaves the theater, the actors on stage are just people in costumes. That's what your absence has done. Without your presence, without your participation, they look around and realize the crown they wore was nothing more than paper. So now they're finally seeing it. Their narrative no longer sticks. The world, or at least the people around you, are beginning to see through the cracks. They notice you never started the chaos. You never picked the fight. All you did was refuse to be owned. That's the twist. Chosen one. The thing that flips the script. And now all their lies, their accusations, their noise, it looks desperate. It looks weak. Because deep down everyone knows the truth. And you, chosen one, need to hold on to this truth like a shield. You were never the problem. You were the one they couldn't control. And when control is all someone has, losing it feels like losing everything. That's why they feared you. That's why they smeared you. That's why they wanted the world to see you as dangerous. But in reality, you were dangerous only to their illusion. The universe always exposes what's false. It always shines light on lies. And that's what's happening now. Slowly but surely, people are seeing it for what it island. The empire they built in their mind was nothing but a circus. And without your part in it, the show collapsed. And the most powerful thing you can do now is smile. Because their loss of control is not your burden to carry, it's their own truth coming to haunt them. Chosen one, you've broken free from the oldest trick in the book. You've slipped out of the grasp of those who needed you to stay small, obedient, and quiet. But now that you stand in your own power, the universe makes sure everyone sees the truth. They're finally realizing it wasn't you who was broken. It was their grip that was weak. So, chosen one, before we go deeper, I want you to do something simple that keeps this energy alive. Drop a comment below with the number 777 to claim your truth and let the universe echo it back to you. And if you feel called, bless this channel with your support, whether it's a like, a share, or even a gift, because every bit of energy you give helps this mission grow stronger. It takes real effort to bring messages like this to life, and your support is what keeps the light moving forward. Remember, when you stand in your power, you inspire others to do the same, and that ripple is unstoppable. So, thank you for being here, for being part of this force, and for choosing freedom over control. And now, let's dive into this step by step. And believe me, if you truly are the chosen one, you'll feel the pull to stay until the very end, because what you're about to hear will confirm exactly why they could never control you. Let's get started. Let's begin with something most people never stop to examine: hatred. Hatred is never as honest as it appears. It rarely comes from truth. More often, it's the mask of fear. And when control is slipping, fear has only one language: anger. That's the first reality you need to hold on to. Their hatred was never yours to carry. It never belonged to you. It was the echo of their fear of losing control. Pause and think about your own story for a moment. How many times have you been accused of being too stubborn, too rebellious, too arrogant, or even hard to love? Those words weren't mirrors reflecting who you are. They were weapons, sharpened and thrown at you to make you question yourself, to convince you that silence was safer than standing tall. And every time you swallowed those words, every time you thought, maybe I am too much, you were stepping closer to the trap they had laid for you. But here's the truth. The accusations were never about you. They were about the loss of grip. When someone depends on control to feel secure, your independence feels like a personal attack. And rather than face their own insecurity, they project it onto you. That's why you became the villain in their story. Not because you caused chaos, but because you refused to be controlled. Now let's make this real with an image. Imagine a fist full of sand. The tighter the grip, the faster the sand slips through the cracks. The more desperately someone tries to hold it, the less they keep. That's what happened with you. The more they squeezed, the more you revealed your independence. And when the last grain slipped away, instead of admitting their hand was never strong enough, they blamed the sand for falling. They blamed you for not being small enough, quiet enough, compliant enough. And here's the paradox. The people who shout loudest about respect are often the very ones who trample over your boundaries. The people who call others toxic are usually the ones poisoning every conversation with manipulation. That's how control works. It flips the story, points fingers outward, and disguises weakness as strength. You became the easiest target because your refusal to bow left them with no script to follow. But time has a way of revealing the cracks. Masks eventually fall, lies collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, and slowly, people around you begin to notice. They notice that you weren't the one picking fights. You weren't the one starting chaos. All you did was refuse to play a role in their performance. And when the audience sees that, the actors on stage lose credibility. Let's step into another perspective. History remembers the free, not the controllers. Nobody writes songs about the chains. Nobody builds statues for the puppet masters. The names that echo through generations are the ones who broke away, who refused to be owned, who carved their own path when conformity was the easier choice. That's why your story matters so deeply. You may not see it yet, but the strength you're showing today will become the story someone else holds on to tomorrow. And isn't it interesting how the labels flip when looked at closely? What they called arrogance was actually your self-respect. What they called disrespect was your refusal to compromise your boundaries. What they called rebellion was your courage to honor your truth. They weren't describing your flaws. They were inventing a narrative where their control looked justified. Ask yourself this: how many times did you exhaust yourself explaining? How many late nights? How many conversations? How many moments did you spend trying to prove your intentions were good? But the harder you tried, the more tangled you became. Like a spider's web, every movement pulled you deeper. That was their tactic all along. Your words became their weapon. Your defenses became their script. And in the end, you realized the only way to win was to stop playing. That's why silence became your liberation. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. When you stopped over-explaining, their entire narrative began to collapse. Because without your voice to twist, all they had left were their lies. And lies standing alone, without fuel, looked desperate. People watching began to wonder, if you're not scrambling, if you're not defending yourself, then why are they the only ones shouting? The spotlight shifted. The story no longer worked. This is the power of stepping into your truth. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to argue to prove yourself. You simply stand. You breathe. You choose not to bend. And in that stillness, the noise around you loses its meaning. Think of a storm raging against a mountain. The storm hurls rain, lightning, thunder, winds, but the mountain doesn't move, it doesn't shout back, it simply stands. That's you. Their chaos was loud, but your calm revealed the difference. The real instability was never in you. It was always in them. This is the moment to release the burden. Their hatred was never your inheritance. It was never a reflection of your worth. It was the sound of their control slipping through their hands. And when control dies, it screams the loudest. That's all you've been hearing, the echo of desperation. Let's make this personal. Every time you stood up for yourself, you forced them to face their own weakness. Every time you said no, you revealed the cracks in their illusion of power. Every time you chose your truth, you reminded them they had no hold over you. And for people addicted to control, that is terrifying. You became a mirror they couldn't break, and mirrors don't lie. So the next time their accusations echo in your memory, stop and ask, were those words ever mine? Or were they proof of someone else's fear? That simple question separates borrowed shame from authentic truth. It keeps your heart clean while their noise fades into the background. And here's where the perspective flips again. You weren't fighting them. You weren't at war with them. You weren't trying to destroy them. You were simply living in your own skin, free, unedited, whole. And that was war enough for people who can only thrive when others stay silent. The good news? Freedom doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't apologize for existing. It doesn't wait for approval. It's simply island, and you've stepped into it, whether they like it or not. So let their hatred dissolve where it belongs, in their hands, not yours. Let their accusations turn to dust in the silence of your refusal. And remember this, their fear was never a reflection of your weakness. It was always the shadow of your strength. Because at the end of the day, the world will not remember the lies they told. It will remember the truth you lived. Their hatred was never proof of your flaws. It was proof of your freedom. And freedom always terrifies those who can't control it. So walk tall, breathe deeply, and let their noise fade. Because the loudest sound you'll ever hear is not their anger, it's the silence of your own peace. There comes a point where you realize something sobering. The people you thought wanted peace never truly wanted peace at all. What they wanted was your silence, your submission, your agreement to vanish inside the comfort of their control. That's why every time you tried to stand in truth, they treated it like rebellion. To them, peace wasn't about equality or respect. Peace was you lowering your voice, dimming your light, and bowing your head. Their version of peace was slavery, dressed in kind words. Picture a wolf walking into a sheep pen. As long as the sheep stay quiet, the wolf calls it harmony. But the moment one sheep raises its head and refuses to bow, the wolf growls, calling it defiance. That's how they treated you. Your independence wasn't aggression, it wasn't violence, it was simply freedom. And freedom, to them, looked like war. Ask yourself this: if someone truly wanted peace, why was peace only possible when you were smaller, quieter, less alive? Why was harmony dependent on your silence? The answer is simple: they never wanted peace. They wanted dominance, and your refusal exposed the difference. This is why they labeled you difficult, not because you were chaotic, but because you wouldn't play along with the script. They didn't understand boundaries, they only understood obedience. And when obedience died, their calmness turned into hostility. That's the mark of false peace. It crumbles the moment control is gone. Real peace doesn't ask you to erase yourself. Real peace allows room for your voice, your choices, your truth. It thrives on fairness, not submission. And deep down, you knew this. That's why you chose the harder road. You chose to disappoint their expectations rather than betray your own soul. Think of it like a chessboard. Every piece is expected to move in line with the king's commands. But then there's you, the piece that moves differently, refusing to follow their pattern. That single refusal shatters the illusion of total control. And when illusion breaks, fear spills out. That's when they ran to others, twisting the story, calling you the troublemaker, the problem, the cause of division. But beneath all the noise, the truth was obvious. You didn't bow, and they couldn't handle that. Notice how the narrative shifts over time. At first, they seem convincing. They speak loudly, dramatize every interaction, and paint themselves as victims of your chaos. But as months pass, the pattern becomes undeniable. The same people who called you unstable carry drama like a shadow everywhere they go. The same ones who claim to love peace are always in conflict, and soon, others begin to see it. They realize the problem was never your presence. The real problem was their addiction to control. And here lies the brutal irony. In trying so hard to brand you as the enemy of peace, they revealed themselves. They showed everyone they never truly valued peace in the first place. What they valued was silence, your silence. And when you refused to give it, they panicked. But what they didn't anticipate is this: your refusal became your shield. You no longer traded your soul for their comfort. You no longer bent just to keep the illusion intact. And that strength carried you further than you imagined. Because once you stop seeking peace from people who confuse peace with control, you find a deeper peace, the kind that can't be taken away. This kind of peace doesn't rely on others playing fair. It comes from within, from knowing that your truth doesn't need permission, from realizing that your boundaries aren't walls, but doors that protect your life from being drained. And once you've tasted that peace, you'll never trade it again. Now, let's peel back another layer. Controllers don't hate you because you fought them. They hate you because you stopped fighting altogether. You stopped explaining, stopped justifying, stopped kneeling, and without your compliance, their power crumbled. Imagine trying to pull a puppet's strings, only to find the strings are cut. The puppet master doesn't cheer, he panics, because without strings, he's just a man holding scraps of rope. That's exactly what your silence did to them. They weren't afraid of your anger. They weren't afraid of your rebellion. They were afraid of your stillness, your refusal to play the game, because without you in the game, the whole performance lost meaning. That's why, to this day, they still talk about you. That's why they whisper your name, spin half-truths, and try to gather allies against you. It's not because you wronged them. It's because your absence revealed them. You walking away stripped their illusion bare, and now they're scrambling to cover it. But here's where the story bends toward you. You don't need to fight to prove anything. You don't need to argue to win back your name. Time is your ally, and truth has a way of rising without effort. Already, people are noticing the cracks. Already, they're questioning the story they were told. Already, they're realizing you weren't the enemy, you were the evidence. And what's left for you now is a choice. Do you keep replaying their accusations in your head, or do you finally set them down where they belong? Do you let their fear linger in your spirit, or do you step forward carrying only your truth? Because the moment you decide, really decide, that their hatred was never yours to hold, you'll feel the weight lift. The next chapter of your life won't be written by the lies they told. It will be written by the freedom you claimed, and that's why you can smile. Because peace wasn't something they ever gave you. Peace was something you chose for yourself the day you stopped bowing. They wanted silence. You chose truth. They wanted submission. You chose freedom. They wanted control. You chose yourself. And that choice is louder than all their noise combined. So remember this. You were never at war with them. You were at war with the illusion they built. And illusions can't win against authenticity. They fade, they crumble, they vanish. And when they do, the only thing left standing is the truth you refuse to trade away. And now, let's move forward. Because once you understand that their hatred was never really about you, the next realization hits even harder. Your independence shook the very foundations of the system they depended on. You weren't just a threat to their control, you were a threat to the entire structure that kept them in power. And that, my friend, is where the story gets even more interesting. You see, the greatest threat to a crooked system isn't destruction. It's exposure. That's what you brought into their world. You didn't tear anything down with your hands. You didn't burn bridges, break walls, or throw punches. What you did was far more dangerous. You noticed. You asked questions. You refused to nod along. You saw through the cracks they worked so hard to cover. And once you saw, you couldn't unsee. That's why your presence shook them. Not because you were loud, not because you were violent, but because you were unafraid to say, "This doesn't look right." For people who rely on illusion, that one sentence is enough to make their empire tremble. Think of a stage play where every actor knows their lines. The music cues perfectly. The audience claps because they believe it's real. But then one actor just one steps out of character. They improvise. They refuse to follow the script. Suddenly, the wires show. The backdrop looks fake. The applause dies. That's what you did. You shattered the performance. And the ones who depended on that performance had no idea how to recover. Here's the irony. Most people don't want fairness. They want comfort. They want predictability. They want to believe in a system that benefits them, even if it's broken. As long as nobody questions it, the illusion works. But the moment you stopped playing along, the mask fell. And once truth walks into a room, the illusion can never fully return. That's why they panicked. That's why they branded you as disruptive. You weren't breaking peace. You were revealing the prison they disguised as peace. Comfort built on silence is nothing more than a cage, and you refuse to sit quietly inside of it. Ask yourself this. If their system was truly strong, why did your independence shake it so badly? Why did one person's refusal to bow cause such fear? The answer is simple. Real authority doesn't collapse when questioned. Real leadership doesn't smear and slander those who challenge it. Real stability doesn't silence truth tellers. It listens. The very fact that your defiance exposed so many cracks proves their power was only an act. Now let's take it deeper. Imagine a tall building shining with glass windows. It looks perfect from the outside, tall, unshakable, impressive. But on the inside, the foundation is rotting. For years, nobody notices. People walk in and out, trusting it will stand. But then one person comes along, knocks gently on the wall, and points out the cracks. Suddenly, the illusion is shattered. People realize the building was always one storm away from collapse. That was you. You didn't create the cracks, you revealed them. And exposure is always what false power fears most. They can't survive truth. They survive silence. They survive complicity. But truth, once spoken, spreads like fire through dry grass. It forces a choice: fix what's broken, or admit you've benefited from it being broken. Most choose to fight the truth teller instead of facing themselves. That's why you became the target. But here's the unshakable fact. Truth doesn't destroy. It only reveals what was already weak. When you stood up, their system didn't break because of you. It broke because it was built on lies. And everyone who witnessed it felt the tremors. Now, think of a magician dazzling the crowd with tricks, pulling coins from ears, making rabbits disappear. Everyone claps, amazed, until one person in the audience whispers, "I saw the string." Suddenly the magic is gone, the trick is ruined. The magician isn't powerful anymore. He's just a man with cheap props. That's what you did. You showed the string, you revealed the wires. And in that moment, they weren't leaders anymore, they were manipulators, exposed for what they truly were. And the most powerful part? You didn't need to scream. You didn't need to riot. You didn't need to beg. Your independence was loud enough. Your refusal to bend was loud enough. That quiet act of saying, "No, I won't be part of this," shook their entire foundation more than any war ever could. That's why they tried to smear your name. That's why they whispered in corners, gathered allies, and painted you as toxic. They needed the story to flip. Because if people saw you clearly, they would have to question the system itself. And questioning the system means admitting the comfort was never real. But over time, masks always fall, disguises always slip, performances always end. People eventually see the truth for what it island. And when that happens, everything they tried to build on illusion collapses. So don't carry guilt for being the disruption. Don't carry shame for breaking the script. Your presence didn't create chaos. Your presence revealed it. And that revelation is priceless. Because here's the reality they'll never admit. Your independence wasn't just a threat to them. It was a wake-up call to everyone watching. It was proof that their system wasn't invincible. It was proof that truth can't be chained forever. And the longer you stand in that truth, the louder it echoes. Until even those who once sided with the system start to question. Until the whispers of doubt become conversations. Until the performance collapses, not with fire, but with silence, because the audience no longer believes. This is where the story deepens. You weren't only a danger to individuals, you were a danger to the entire foundation they lived on. And when foundations crack, everything built on top trembles. That's why their fear ran so deep. Not because you screamed, but because you simply stood. And that's what we'll dive into next. How your refusal to bow didn't just expose individuals, it shook the very system that fed them. And when the system shakes, even those who once clapped for it begin to question if the show was ever real. Silence is often misunderstood. People think silence is weakness, retreat, surrender. But in the hands of someone who has finally learned their worth, silence becomes the sharpest weapon of all. That's what you discovered. For so long, they thrived on your explanations. Every defense you gave, every justification you offered, every attempt to prove your innocence, it was all food for their narrative. They didn't want the truth. They wanted fragments of your voice to twist into their script. And the cruel part, the more you explained, the more guilty they made you look. That was their game. They would drag you into endless debates, knowing that every word you spoke could be bent against you. And you, thinking you were clarifying, only gave them more ammunition. Like a spider weaving a web, they didn't need to trap you by force. They lured you into struggling, thrashing, explaining, until you tangled yourself further. But then something shifted. You stopped. You stopped defending yourself to people who had already chosen blindness. You stopped pouring your energy into convincing people who never wanted to be convinced. You stopped offering pieces of your truth to those who only turned them into weapons. And in that silence, their entire narrative began to collapse. Because here's the irony. They expected your silence to make you look guilty. They thought that if you weren't scrambling to defend yourself, people would assume their story was true. But instead, the opposite happened. People began to notice the imbalance. Why are they always shouting? Why are they always on the attack? Why is the other person calm? And suspicion quietly shifted. That's the hidden strength of silence. Lies scream for attention. They need to be shouted, repeated, forced into ears. But truth doesn't beg. Truth waits. Truth doesn't need constant validation. It's simply island. And your silence said more than any explanation ever could. It said, "My life is not up for debate." It said, "My worth doesn't need witnesses." It said, "My soul does not answer to your insecurity." And that shook them more than any argument ever would. Now, imagine a fire. It thrives on fuel, oxygen, wood, anything it can consume. But take away the fuel, and the fire burns itself out. That's what your silence did. You stopped feeding them. You stopped giving them something to twist. And without your words, their lies suffocated. They were left shouting into an empty void, and their voices echoed back at them. Here's something worth holding close. Refusing to explain yourself is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is strength. Because some people don't want understanding, they want control. And no amount of explaining will ever change that. And over time, the silence began to speak louder than words ever could. People started to notice patterns. They saw that when you weren't around, the so-called chaos disappeared. They saw that the ones pointing fingers were often standing at the center of the storm. Slowly, doubt began to creep in, and eventually, the truth stood taller than their lies. But let's not pretend it was easy. Silence isn't easy when your character is under attack. Silence isn't easy when you know you could explain everything if someone would just listen. Silence isn't easy when you're being misunderstood. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is close your mouth and let time fight for you. Because here's the secret. Truth doesn't panic when it's misunderstood. Only lies panic. Truth is steady. Truth is patient. Truth knows that eventually, masks slip, performances end, illusions fade, and what remains is reality. Think of it like water carving a canyon. It doesn't roar, it doesn't shout, it doesn't argue with the rock. It flows, steady and consistent, until the rock surrenders. That's what your silence became, a steady force, carving away the lies until only the truth remained. And while they scrambled to keep the performance alive, you were free. You no longer lived in their courtroom. You no longer wasted nights writing speeches in your head, planning the perfect explanation. You stopped rehearsing for trials that were never fair. Instead, you reclaimed your energy. You reclaimed your time. You reclaimed your peace. And in that shift, something powerful happened. You weren't just free from them, you were free from needing them. Their approval no longer dictated your choices. Their accusations no longer controlled your emotions. Their games no longer had the same effect. You weren't tangled in their web anymore. You were outside of it, watching them spin in desperation. That is the gift of silence. It doesn't just expose liars, it liberates you. So let me leave you with this reflection. You don't need to prove yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to explain yourself to people who twist every word. You don't need to play defense when the truth is already on your side. Because in the end, silence will say what words never could. I know who I am. I know my worth. I know my truth. And nothing you say can change it. And that truth becomes the ground you stand on. Firm, unshakable, calm. Now, as you step into this understanding, realize this silence wasn't the only weapon you carried. Boundaries were too. And when you began setting them, they didn't see wisdom. They saw rebellion. They mistook your shield for a sword. And that's where our journey leads next. When control is someone's religion, the word no sounds like blasphemy. That's why your boundaries felt like rebellion to them. You weren't staging a revolt. You weren't attacking. You were simply protecting your own humanity. But in their eyes, every limit you drew was an act of war. Think of a king sitting on a throne, convinced his word is law. For years, people kneel, nod, and obey. Then one day, someone simply doesn't bow. No insults, no weapons, just refusal. The king doesn't see it as dignity, he sees it as uprising. That's exactly how they treated you. Your boundaries weren't aggression, they were protection. But to people addicted to control, protection looks like rebellion. Ask yourself this. If someone truly cares for you, do they rage at your boundaries, or do they honor them? Genuine love respects limits, even when it doesn't understand them. But those who depend on dominance, those who need unlimited access to you, rage when they're told no, because no means they can no longer drain you, manipulate you, or bend you at will. That's the irony of boundaries. They don't wound anyone, they shield the one holding them. They don't take life, they preserve it. And yet, to those who feed on control, your shield felt like a sword. Every time you refused to be disrespected, every time you declined to be used, every time you said no to being drained, they branded it rebellion. Why? Because your boundaries stripped them of leverage. Boundaries reminded them that you were never theirs to own. And here's the beauty. Boundaries reveal intentions faster than words ever could. Every time they mocked your limits, every time they pushed against your no, they revealed their true motive. They weren't seeking partnership. They weren't seeking peace. They were seeking control. And when you didn't comply, their anger exposed them louder than your silence ever did. But look deeper. They called your limits disrespect. Yet weren't you simply preserving your dignity? They labeled your no as chaos, Yet wasn't it their desperation that stirred chaos? They claimed you were rebellious. But rebellion is rising against what's right. You weren't rising against truth, you were rising against lies. It was never rebellion, it was self-respect. Now picture a gate. A healthy relationship sees the gate and says, "I'll knock when I come by, I'll wait until you open." But control sees the gate and screams, "Why does this exist? Why can't I come and go whenever I want?" That's the difference. Healthy people see boundaries as doors. Controllers see them as walls. And when they realized your gates had locks, they panicked. Because for the first time, they couldn't enter without permission. They couldn't storm in and take what they wanted. They couldn't treat your life like property. They saw the locks as chains. But really, they were keys you finally used to secure your soul. Of course, they tried to twist the story. They called you selfish, difficult, cold, unkind. But time always reveals truth. Over weeks, months, years, people watching began to notice something. You weren't cutting people off at random. You weren't shutting love out. You were simply refusing to be mistreated. And that wasn't cruelty. That was wisdom. Here's the sobering reality. People who fight your boundaries were never for you in the first place. Because if they truly loved you, they would rejoice in your self-respect. They would celebrate your courage to guard your heart. They would honor your no as much as your yes. But instead, they treated your dignity as defiance. And that tells you everything you need to know. So carry this truth with you. Your boundaries were never rebellion, they were revelation. They revealed who was safe, who was genuine, who was trustworthy, and who only wanted access, not relationship. And the more you lived in your truth, the more the mask slipped from those who resisted it. The people who accused you of being difficult showed themselves to be unreasonable. The people who claimed you were chaotic revealed their own instability. The people who screamed about your rebellion proved they were never leaders, only takers. And with every step, you saw it more clearly. You weren't the problem. You were the proof. Proof that freedom is possible. Proof that respect is non-negotiable. Proof that you could live without chains. That's why they couldn't forgive you, because your boundaries reminded them of their lack of courage to draw their own. You became evidence that they didn't need to stay small, but they chose to. And rather than face that truth, they fought you instead. So don't regret a single boundary. Don't second-guess a single no. Those no's were the most powerful yes you could ever give. Yes to your peace, yes to your dignity, yes to your freedom. And as you step deeper into this reality, you'll see the next truth unfold. To keep their illusion alive, they had to paint you as the villain. Because if the world ever saw you clearly, the chains they built would shatter in an instant. Controllers can't wear the mask of savior unless they first cast someone else as the villain. That's the dirty secret. They couldn't dominate you openly, so they built a story instead. A story where their control looked like protection and your freedom looked like danger. That's why they demonized you. It wasn't about who you were. It wasn't about your heart, your character, or your intentions. It was about preserving their illusion. If they could convince others that you were reckless, selfish, or unstable, then suddenly their grip didn't look oppressive anymore. It looked noble. It looked necessary. Imagine a firefighter setting a blaze and then running into the flames, pretending to save everyone. That's what they did. They exaggerated your flaws, twisted your words, and turned simple disagreements into rebellions. Your independence became arrogance. Your boundaries became hostility. Your voice became chaos. They weren't describing you, they were inventing you. They created a version of you that justified their chains. And here's the brutal truth. People are quicker to believe a loud lie than a quiet truth. They knew this, so they shouted their story over and over, hoping repetition would sound like evidence. They made you the scapegoat, the explanation for every tension and every storm. And for a while, some believed them. But lies have a short lifespan. Lies sprint, but truth runs the marathon. Over time, people started to notice something strange. When you weren't in the room, the so-called chaos vanished. When you weren't around, the storms died down. Yet the same person who called you the villain always seemed to be standing at the center of the storm. And slowly, doubt began to creep in. People started asking, if they were truly the savior, why does drama follow them everywhere they go? Why does peace only seem to exist when they're quiet, not when you are gone? The mask began to slip, and the story no longer made sense. That's the power of truth. It doesn't need defense. It doesn't need constant shouting. It doesn't need propaganda. It just waits. Time exposes what performance tries to hide. You didn't have to wage war to clear your name. You didn't need to exhaust yourself proving innocence. The truth worked silently in your favor. Every false accusation was a stone they thought they were throwing at you, but in reality, they were building their own wall of exposure. One lie stacked on another until it became impossible to ignore. And here's the irony: they thought the story they built would destroy you, but it destroyed their credibility instead. Because when masks fall, people realize the only villain in the story was the one clinging to the chains. Think about it. Did you ever smear their name? Did you ever rally people against them? Did you ever need to exaggerate the truth to make them look small? You didn't have to. Their actions spoke loudly enough. You didn't have to fabricate a version of them. Their own behavior exposed who they really were. That's the difference between illusion and authenticity. Illusion has to shout to be believed. Authenticity only has to exist, and you chose existence. You chose to live your truth, even when it meant being misunderstood for a season. So don't despise that season. Don't regret it. Because all along, truth was gathering weight. It was waiting for the moment to rise, and when it did, the lies couldn't stand against it. And here's the deeper meaning: your story isn't just about you. It's about everyone who has ever been labeled the problem for daring to live free. It's about every soul who has been demonized for refusing to play small. You are part of a larger pattern, a lineage of people who refuse to bow to false thrones. That's why your presence is unforgettable. You remind others that they don't have to believe the lies spoken over them. You remind them that they don't have to shrink to be accepted. You remind them that authenticity will always outlast performance. So when they painted you as the villain, they thought they were silencing you. But really, they were spotlighting you. Because now the world can see the truth for what it is. You weren't the danger. You were the proof. Proof that freedom is possible. Proof that control is fragile. Proof that truth endures. And the most powerful part? By trying to destroy you, they revealed themselves. Their smear campaign wasn't your downfall. It was their confession. That's why you can walk forward without fear. Because in the end, the world won't remember their accusations. It will remember your strength. It will remember the dignity you carried. It will remember the way you stood tall when others tried to tear you down. And now, we take the next step. Because if casting you as the villain didn't work, they had to find a new tactic. And that tactic was dependency. They tried to make you believe that without them, you couldn't survive. But what happens when their grip no longer feeds you? That's what comes next. Nothing terrifies a controller more than realizing you don't need them. Dependency is the soil where their power grows. As long as you believed their approval was your oxygen, they could keep you tethered. But the moment you realized you could breathe without them, everything changed. It wasn't your anger that shook them. It wasn't your defiance. It was the quiet, steady truth that you were no longer dependent on their validation, their crumbs of attention, their manufactured sense of importance. You had learned how to stand alone, and for people who thrive on control, nothing is more unforgivable than independence. Picture a puppeteer tugging strings. He expects the puppet to dance. He expects it to obey. But one day, the strings go slack. The puppet no longer moves. It stands upright on its own. Suddenly, the puppeteer's tricks don't work anymore. He's not powerful. He's just a man with useless strings in his hands. That's what happened when you stopped needing them. Their influence evaporated the moment you no longer relied on it. Control feeds on dependency. It feeds on fear of rejection. It feeds on your hunger for approval. It feeds on your willingness to shrink so they can feel tall. But when that hunger dies, when the fear disappears, control suffocates. And that's exactly what you did. You starved their power. They couldn't bribe you with scraps of affection anymore. They couldn't dangle guilt over your head like a noose. They couldn't keep you chained with the threat of rejection. Every tactic that enslaved others crumbled against you like waves breaking on stone. And the irony? They called your independence betrayal. They said you were cold, distant, disloyal. But you weren't betraying them. You were liberating yourself. You weren't rejecting connection. You were rejecting control. You weren't killing love. You were killing manipulation. But because they had no idea how to exist without leverage, they painted freedom as treason. Imagine a jailer walking past a row of cells, keys clanging at his belt. For years, he's believed he has power over the prisoners. But then one day, the prisoners realize the doors were never locked. They step out, free. Suddenly, the jailer's keys mean nothing. His authority collapses in an instant. That's exactly what happened when you claimed your independence. They were never your keeper. They were only playing the role until you discovered the door was open all along. And here's the deeper truth: your independence didn't just free you, it exposed them. Because once their tricks stopped working, everyone around could see the reality. They weren't protectors. They weren't providers. They weren't leaders. They were manipulators hiding behind titles and authority. And without your dependency, their disguise disintegrated. That's why they panicked. That's why they clawed and grabbed to pull you back under their influence. Because without your need, they had no leverage. And when leverage disappears, so does the illusion of power. But let me say this clearly: your independence gave you peace. For the first time, you weren't walking on eggshells, terrified of losing their approval. For the first time, you could breathe without asking permission. For the first time, you realized the foundation under your feet wasn't theirs, it was yours all along. That's the secret of independence. It doesn't just weaken their control, it makes you unshakable. When you stop needing what they claim to withhold, you stop being their prisoner. And once you're free, there is no going back. So remember this: their panic wasn't proof that you were wrong, it was proof that you were powerful. Their anger wasn't evidence of betrayal, it was evidence of your freedom. Their accusations weren't confessions about you, they were confessions about themselves. And now, as you stand in your independence, something even more profound is revealed. Their power was never real in the first place. It wasn't earned. It was borrowed from your belief, borrowed from your consent, borrowed from your silence. And once you stopped lending it, they had nothing left. That's where we're headed next. Because the truth is, they never had power over you. They were squatters in space that was always yours, and the moment you reclaimed it, their throne turned to dust. Borrowed power always collapses. That's the truth controllers never want you to realize. The authority they flaunted over you was never earned. It was rented space inside your mind, and the lease only lasted as long as you didn't know your own strength. For a time, you may have believed it. Maybe you were conditioned to think their approval was your lifeline. Maybe you thought their validation was the oxygen you needed to survive. Maybe you confused loyalty with submission, patience with permission, silence with weakness. And while you lived in that fog, they strutted as though their control was permanent. But borrowed power has an expiration date. The very moment you said, "I know who I am now," their time was up. Imagine a landlord who parades through a house, boasting about his authority, laying down rules, acting like a king. But what happens when the rightful owner walks in holding the deed? The landlord shrinks into irrelevance. His dominance dissolves instantly. That's what happened when you reclaimed your truth. They were never kings. They were squatters, trespassing in a space that never belonged to them. Earned power is different. Earned power comes with respect, rooted in wisdom, trust, and integrity. Borrowed power, it's fragile. It survives only as long as someone stays unaware of their worth. And the day you woke up, the chain broke. They mistook your patience for surrender. They mistook your loyalty for obedience. They mistook your silence for weakness. But none of those were permission slips. They were choices you made while you were still growing into yourself. The moment you stepped fully into that growth, their performance collapsed. That's why they scrambled to pull you back under. It wasn't love they were losing. It wasn't relationship they mourned. It was leverage. Without your consent, without your agreement, without your dependence, their illusion of power vanished. And here's the irony: they never had real power at all. They had borrowed influence, and you were the lender. You gave them access to your energy, your time, your emotions. You allowed their voice to sit at the head of your table. But when you pulled the chair away, their throne was revealed for what it always was: an empty seat. Think of it like smoke. It looks heavy, it looks thick, it looks overwhelming. But wave your hand through it, and you realize there's nothing solid there. That's what their control really was: smoke and mirrors. A performance only possible because you believed it had weight. And once you saw it clearly, there was no going back. You stopped handing them the keys to your emotions. You stopped letting them script your choices. You stopped carrying shame that didn't belong to you. And in that moment, the power they claimed turned to dust. That's the cruel comedy of control. It only works if you agree to it. It's not actual strength. It's agreement dressed up as dominance, and the day you withdrew your agreement, their empire fell. So let me say this plainly. They never owned you. They only occupied the space you allowed. They borrowed your silence. They borrowed your doubt. They borrowed your uncertainty. And when you woke up, they had to return it all. And here's where the shift deepens. When you finally reclaim what was always yours, you don't just weaken their grip, you dismantle the entire illusion. You realize the voice that once shook you now sounds hollow. The threats that once scared you now sound absurd. The shame they tried to place on you now falls to the ground because it doesn't stick anymore. And that's when panic sets in for them. They realize that without your agreement, they're powerless. They can no longer pull the strings. They can no longer dictate your path. They can no longer pretend to be your keeper. And the truth is exposed. The only authority over your life is you. This revelation is both liberating and sobering, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize borrowed power, you'll notice it everywhere in systems, in relationships, in communities. You'll see who's pretending to be in charge and who actually carries respect. You'll see the difference between control built on fear and influence built on truth. And you'll never again mistake one for the other. So let this truth anchor you. Their power was never real. It was borrowed. And the day you reclaimed what was always yours, they were left with nothing but smoke and mirrors, nothing but empty seats and broken scripts, nothing but the hollow echo of their desperation. And from here, the story only gets clearer, because the next realization will hit even harder. Their entire theater, their entire performance, depended on you playing your role. And when you walked off the stage, the whole production collapsed. Control has never been true strength. It's theater, it's performance, and every performance needs actors. Every act requires an audience. That's the secret they never wanted you to realize. Without your role, the show couldn't go on. For years, you played the parts they assigned. You were the scapegoat when they needed someone to blame. You were the pleaser when they needed comfort. You were the quiet one when they demanded silence. You were the sacrifice when they needed someone to carry the weight of their dysfunction. The script worked flawlessly because you followed it. But here's what's important to understand. You weren't weak for playing those roles. You were conditioned. Conditioned to believe that silence meant safety. Conditioned to think submission kept the peace. Conditioned to equate shrinking yourself with stability. That conditioning kept the theater alive far longer than it should have. Then came the turning point. You stepped off the stage. You stopped reciting the lines. You refused to hold up the scenery, to hand them the props, to play along in their grand illusion. And just like that, the spotlight dimmed. The applause died. The show fell apart. Imagine a magician dazzling a crowd with tricks, doves from hats, smoke from sleeves. But then the assistant steps away. Suddenly, the magician fumbles. The illusions don't work. The crowd sees the wires. The act collapses. That's exactly what happened when you walked away from their theater. Their control wasn't power, it was choreography, and the choreography only survived as long as you played along. Ask yourself this: who do they blame now that you no longer carry their guilt? Who do they silence now that you've found your voice? Who do they drain now that you've set your boundaries? The answer is simple: no one. And without someone to play the role, the stage goes empty. And here's the paradox. They didn't fear rebellion. They feared indifference. Rebellion means you're still on the stage, still in the fight, still part of the act. Indifference means you've left the theater altogether. And without an audience, without actors, their power loses its meaning. That's why they fought so hard to drag you back into character. That's why they painted you as unstable, ungrateful, disloyal. They weren't trying to destroy you. They were trying to lure you back into the performance. Because without you, their story crumbled. Without you, they had to face themselves. And that's the raw truth. They weren't leaders. They were manipulators. They weren't protectors. They were exploiters. They weren't victims of your so-called rebellion. They were addicts, starving without your compliance. But here's the beauty: you didn't need to destroy them. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to shout or scream. All it took was walking off their stage, choosing authenticity over acting, choosing truth over performance, choosing freedom over illusion. And with that single decision, their empire of pretense collapsed. Because control doesn't vanish when you fight harder, it vanishes when you refuse to participate. That's the power you carry. You don't have to burn the theater down. You just have to stop performing in it. And when you do, the curtains fall, the lights fade, and the fraud stands exposed for what it always was, a script without substance. So now you know. Their control wasn't strength, it was theater, and the day you left, the curtain closed. But let's take it even deeper, because when the performance ends, when the noise stops, something profound happens. You begin to see who you really were all along. Not the character they forced you to play, but the steady anchor in the middle of their storm. And that revelation is where the story takes us next. Storms are loud, chaotic, unpredictable. Anchors are steady, quiet, immovable. That's the contrast that became clear the moment you stopped performing in their theater. They weren't stability. They were the storm. You were the anchor. They wanted you to crack under pressure. They wanted you to lash out, to spiral, to prove their story right. Every provocation was designed to bait you into chaos. Because if you lost control, they could point and say, "See, you were the problem all along." But you didn't, and that's what broke them. Imagine a storm thrashing against a mountain. The winds roar, lightning flashes, rain floods the ground, yet the mountain doesn't move. That's you. Every accusation hurled, every whisper spread, every scheme launched, it all crashed against your steadiness. They mistook your calm for weakness, but really, your calm was the weapon that dismantled them. Control thrives on instability. If you had raged, if you had fought recklessly, they would have used it as proof to tighten their grip, but your refusal to spiral left their narrative stranded. You didn't match their chaos. You observed it. You endured it. And in that endurance, the truth began to show itself. Isn't it strange how the people who label you dramatic are usually the ones creating drama? Isn't it strange how those who call you unstable are the ones constantly shifting, breaking, unraveling? Their accusations were never descriptions. They were projections. You were the mirror they didn't want to face. And here's the paradox that burned them most. Your composure didn't prove they still had power. It proved they had lost it. They couldn't shake you anymore. They couldn't bend you, break you, or bait you. And the more they tried, the more obvious their instability became to everyone around them. Think of it this way: chaos always calls calmness cold, because calmness refuses to play along. They accused you of being heartless because you didn't match their theatrics. But calm isn't absence. Calm is power. Calm is clarity. Calm is knowing the difference between what deserves your energy and what doesn't. Over time, people began to notice. The outbursts, the lies, the manipulation, it didn't come from you, it came from them. The storm wasn't yours, you were the mountain. And no amount of twisting could erase that truth. This is why they'll never forgive you. Because without raising a hand, without shouting, without even fighting back, you revealed who was truly unstable. Your steadiness exposed their chaos. Your calm exposed their desperation. Your refusal to bow revealed that their power was never strength, it was performance. And this is your triumph. You never needed to apologize for being unshakable. You never needed to shrink to make others feel tall. You never needed to surrender your peace for the illusion of harmony. The very fact that they had to twist, smear, and manipulate proves the strength of your anchor rattled them more than compliance ever could. So now, when the storm tries to return, remember this. You don't need to fight every gust of wind. You don't need to chase down every rumor. You don't need to respond to every wave. You only need to stand. Because mountains don't chase storms. They endure them until the skies clear. And when the skies do clear, something becomes undeniable. You weren't the storm. You were the constant. You weren't the chaos. You were the calm. You weren't the problem. You were the proof. And that proof now opens the door to the next revelation. Their mask of stability wasn't just about appearances. It was about survival. Because once their control slipped, they had nothing left but fear. And that fear would drive them to desperate measures to hold on. Fear is a strange teacher. It doesn't just whisper in shadows, it drives people to cling tighter to illusions. And when control began slipping from their hands, fear pushed them into desperation. They realized something they could never admit aloud. Without control, they had nothing. That's why the mask of stability mattered so much. They needed people to believe they were steady, wise, unshakable leaders. But behind closed doors, fear rattled every move they made. And the more your independence exposed their weakness, the harder they fought to hide it. Think of a house of cards. It looks impressive, balanced, even elegant. But everyone knows a single gust of wind could send it tumbling. Instead of reinforcing the structure, they hovered around it, panicking at the slightest movement. That was them. And when you walked by with calm independence, it was as if a breeze swept through their illusion. The house of cards trembled, not because you attacked it, but because it was fragile all along. And in that panic, they tried every tactic. First came the whispers, then the accusations, then the attempts to smear your name. When that failed, they tried guilt. When guilt didn't work, they tried shame. When shame didn't land, they tried to convince others you were dangerous. Each attempt was another desperate move to keep the illusion standing. But what they never understood is this: truth doesn't require defense. Truth doesn't panic when challenged. Truth doesn't hide behind masks. The louder they shouted, the clearer the contrast became. You were steady, they were scrambling. You were calm, they were chaotic. You were grounded, they were clinging. And people noticed. Slowly at first, quietly. A question here, a doubt there. But over time, the pattern became undeniable. The villain they painted you to be didn't match reality. The mask they wore didn't match their actions. And when masks and actions don't align, people start to see what's real. Here's the irony: they thought fear would hold you down. They thought their tactics would make you shrink. But fear didn't paralyze you. Fear taught you. Fear revealed where their power ended and where yours began. Because every time they tried to cage you with fear, you chose freedom instead. And each choice weakened their grip. Think of a torch in a cave. The cave looks endless, filled with shadows, with shapes that terrify the imagination. But one light, one flame, reveals the truth. It's not endless. It's not filled with monsters. It's just walls. That's what you did. Your courage became the flame. And once the cave was lit, their shadows had nowhere left to hide. And maybe this is the most important lesson. Their fear was never truly about you. It was about what you represented. You represented choice. You represented freedom. You represented proof that someone could step outside the system and still survive. And that terrified them more than anything. Because if you could live free, what excuse did they have for staying chained? That's why they called you reckless. That's why they painted you as dangerous. Not because you were wrong, but because your freedom reminded them of their own surrender. You became a mirror they couldn't bear to face. And now, with the mask slipping, with their fear exposed, the truth is impossible to ignore. They never had stability. They never had strength. They only had performance. And when the curtain dropped, fear stood where power once pretended to be. This is where your story takes another turn. Because once fear is exposed, the scramble becomes more desperate, and desperation pushes people to reveal their truest selves. That's why the next chapter matters so much, because when the lies collapse, when the fear surfaces, when the mask falls completely, they'll show you who they always were underneath. And that revelation will change everything. When masks fall, the truth finally stands naked. And though it can be unsettling, it's also liberating, because now you see what was hidden all along. You see who they really were beneath the roles, beneath the noise, beneath the performance. For a long time, they survived by inventing stories. They made themselves the victim, the savior, the noble authority. They twisted every situation so that control looked like leadership and your independence looked like betrayal. But once fear stripped those disguises away, what remained was raw and undeniable. Insecurity, wearing borrowed crowns. Think of a stage actor caught without a costume. The makeup fades, the lights go out, and suddenly the person who seemed larger than life is just a human, fragile and uncertain. That's what exposure does. It takes away the props. It takes away the script. It leaves only reality. And reality is where their power evaporated. When the mask fell, people began to notice details they had once ignored. They noticed the inconsistencies in their words. They noticed how their accusations didn't match the evidence. They noticed how the drama seemed to follow them, not you. And slowly, the narrative shifted. This shift wasn't loud. It wasn't instant. It was quiet, like the turning of a tide. But once it started, it couldn't be stopped. Because once people see truth, they can't unsee it. Once they notice the cracks, they can't pretend the wall is solid anymore. And this left them exposed in the most painful way. Not only could they no longer control you, they could no longer control the story. The illusion they had built for so long now worked against them. Every attempt to smear you, every desperate move to regain ground, only revealed more of who they were. Their strategies backfired, and the audience they depended on started walking out of the theater. Here's the revelation. Their downfall didn't come from your rebellion. It came from their obsession with control. Their lies collapsed because lies always do. Their fear surfaced because fear can't stay buried forever, and their mask fell because authenticity has a way of burning through pretense. Now think about what that means for you. For so long, you may have felt weighed down by their accusations. You may have wondered if their words carried truth. But the falling mask proves it never did. The weakness they tried to pin on you was theirs. The chaos they accused you of carrying was theirs. The instability they projected onto you was theirs. And now, the evidence stands clear for anyone willing to see. And here's the part that gives you peace. You didn't have to destroy them. You didn't have to retaliate. You didn't even have to argue. All you had to do was live in your truth long enough for the mask to fall. Time did the work. Reality did the work. Truth did the work. So where does that leave you now? Free. Free from the role they cast you in. Free from the guilt they projected. Free from the illusion that their power was permanent. And in that freedom, you discover something they never expected. You discover your voice. Because once the mask falls, there's nothing left to fear. You no longer need to explain. You no longer need to prove. You no longer need to bend. You only need to stand, knowing the truth has already cleared the air. This is the turning point. The season where you move from defense to creation. The season where you stop carrying their story and start writing your own. The season where the spotlight no longer shines on their performance, but on your authenticity. And that authenticity will carry you further than you realize, because the world doesn't remember the ones who wore masks, it remembers the ones who dared to take them off. So now, with the mask gone and the truth standing in the open, the question becomes, how do you build from here? How do you step into the power that was always yours, but was hidden beneath the weight of their lies? That's where we're heading next. Stepping into your own power after the mask falls is like breathing fresh air for the first time. For so long you were forced to inhale the smoke of their illusions, convinced it was the only oxygen available, but now, you realize the air was always yours. You were never trapped, it only felt that way because of the fog they created. This is the moment when freedom begins to take shape, not just in theory, but in practice. You stop reacting to them, you stop replaying old conversations, you stop carrying accusations that were never yours. Instead, you begin to move differently, you begin to live differently. Every step you take outside their shadow becomes a declaration, I belong to myself now. And here's what makes it powerful. Freedom doesn't need to announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply exists. And the more you walk in it, the more undeniable it becomes. But there's another layer. Your independence didn't just weaken their grip on you, it weakened the entire system that fed them. Systems built on fear and silence depend on everyone playing their part. When one person refuses, the cracks spread, the illusion wobbles, others start to notice. Think of a domino line stretching across a table. Every piece leans on the next, holding the pattern together. But if one domino refuses to fall, the whole chain stops. That's you. Your refusal to collapse with the rest disrupted the entire sequence, and in doing so, you exposed how fragile the system really was. This is why your presence has always felt threatening to them. It wasn't that you were loud or destructive, it was that you showed another way was possible. Your existence outside their control became living proof that the system wasn't unbreakable. And proof is dangerous because once it exists, no one can deny it. That's why they tried so hard to silence you. Not because your truth was wrong, but because it was undeniable. They didn't fear rebellion. They feared exposure. They feared that once people saw your freedom, they'd begin to question their own chains. And here's the beautiful irony. You didn't have to convince anyone. You didn't have to start a revolution. All you had to do was stand in your truth. That was enough to make people wonder, if they can live free, why can't I? That question spreads faster than any rumor. It plants itself in quiet minds, in tired hearts, in weary souls. It whispers in the dark, maybe I don't have to live this way anymore. And soon, what was once unthinkable becomes possible. That's the ripple effect of your freedom, and the ones who relied on control know this. That's why their anger runs so deep, because your independence didn't just change you, it changed the air around you. It forced others to see what they'd been pretending not to notice. It turned their stage lights into harsh spotlights, revealing every crack, every flaw, every false claim. That's why they'll say you're dangerous. Not because you destroy, but because you reveal. Not because you harm, but because you expose. Not because you create chaos, but because you refuse to hide it anymore. And the truth is, that's exactly what makes you unstoppable. You don't fight their system by tearing it down. You fight it by standing outside of it, by refusing to kneel, by showing that life continues just fine without their control. That's the power of authenticity. It doesn't beg, it doesn't bow, it doesn't break. It's simply island. And when it is, the false has no choice but to collapse around it. So where do you go from here? You walk forward, not as a survivor of their control, but as a creator of your freedom. You begin to shape a new life, one not dictated by fear, guilt, or manipulation. You begin to speak with a voice that no longer trembles. You begin to live in a way that reminds others they can too. And here's the most profound part. You become a mirror not of their weakness, but of possibility. You show others that freedom isn't just a dream, it's a choice. That peace isn't just a promise, it's a practice. That power isn't something handed down, it's something reclaimed. This is the path opening before you. And as you continue to walk it, the story shifts one last time. Because now, it's not about what they did to you, it's about who you've become without them. And that final truth is what we'll uncover next. Freedom changes the story. Up until now, everything was about what they tried to take from you, what they tried to make you believe, what illusions they built to keep you in place. But the moment you stepped out of their grip, the story stopped being about them and started being about you. This is where the shift happens. No more wasted energy defending yourself against lies. No more proving your worth to people who were never willing to see it. No more performing in theaters that only existed to keep you small. You've walked off that stage. The curtain has closed. The noise has faded. And now the silence belongs to you. Think of it like stepping out of a storm into open air. At first, you still feel the rain on your skin, the wind in your hair, the echo of thunder in your ears. But slowly, your body remembers calm. Slowly, you notice the sky clearing, the sun breaking through. That's where you are now, stepping into a life no longer defined by the storm, but by the strength you discovered within it. And here's the truth. You are not just free from them, you are free for yourself, free to create, free to love without fear, free to stand without apology, free to live without chains. The energy that was once drained by defending, explaining, or fighting is now fuel for building, dreaming, and becoming. But this freedom carries responsibility, not the kind that weighs you down, the kind that calls you higher, because your story isn't just yours anymore. Others are watching, others are listening, others are quietly asking themselves if they too can walk away from their storms, their theaters, their puppet masters. And when they look at you, they see proof. That's why your journey matters, because freedom isn't selfish, freedom is contagious. Every step you take in truth becomes a map for someone else. Every boundary you honor becomes permission for someone else to set theirs. Every breath you take in peace becomes a reminder that peace is possible, even after chaos. And make no mistake, there will be voices that still try to pull you back, not because you owe them anything, but because your freedom unsettles their captivity. There will be whispers that say you're arrogant, that you've changed, that you've abandoned what was normal. But you already know the truth. You didn't change to become less, you changed to finally become yourself. So, here's what you hold on to now. The power you carry is not in rebellion, but in refusal. Refusal to be controlled, refusal to be silenced, refusal to be anything less than whole. And with that refusal comes a deeper yes, a yes to authenticity, to dignity, to the life you were meant to live all along. And if ever you doubt, remember this. History doesn't celebrate the ones who clung to chains. History remembers the ones who broke them, the ones who stepped out, the ones who stood firm, the ones who refused to let fear define them. That's the lineage you belong to now. So, walk forward with confidence, not looking back at the theater that crumbled, not fearing the storm that's already passed, not carrying the shame that never belonged to you. Walk forward as proof, proof that truth endures, proof that freedom is stronger than control, proof that authenticity wins over illusion every single time. And as you carry that truth, Know this: you are part of something bigger than yourself. A ripple that spreads, a light that exposes, a freedom that refuses to fade. Because at the end of it all, it was never about their chains. It was always about your courage to cut them. And now the story is no longer theirs to tell. It's yours.